Hi and welcome back. Today we're continuing our mini-series on my design process. Today is about the conceptual design. If that sounds good, stick around. Hello, welcome to the Woodgrafter. I'm Andy Guile and our mission here is to inspire, educate and support you in your journey to becoming a better woodworker. We do that through a whole series of videos, step-by-step how-to project guides, tool tips, reviews, techniques, setups, safe usage, and videos like this one where now and then we take a subject that's interesting and explore it. So if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing now, leave me a thumbs up, get engaged by some comments, and with that said, let's get cracking. So this is part 2 in my mini design series. In the first episode we looked at the customer engagement, understanding the idea, what the customer wants, looking for some design influences and really getting a rough idea of what we're going to produce. In this episode we're going to take that knowledge and we're going to focus in on the conceptual design. This gives us the visual representation we can share with the customer and make some final tweaks. Next episode we're going to look at the detailed design and how I turn that concept into something we can use in the workshop.
Now that we've got a rough idea of what we want to do, I'm going to come over into SketchUp and we'll start to knock up what I call a concept drawing. A concept drawing is one that's not really got detail inside, so I don't worry too much at this point about joinery or the detail of it. It's purely an idea, a mock-up of what it's going to look like that I can share with the customer. I find that if I go into too much detail now and do the joints and the customer wants to make a change, it's very hard to go back and do that. If you've already cut the mortise and tenons inside the legs of a table, for example, and the customer wants the legs to be a different size or shape, you've got to go back to the drawing board. So concept drawing gets around that problem. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm just going to call this layer rug. And by selecting that layer, I can now give myself a design on the floor the size of the rug. Now we know the rug is 1,700 millimeters long by 1,200 millimeters wide. So you can now see I've got the space I'm going to work with. Remember we had an inner part of the rug as well, so I just want to sketch that inner part on the rug. So I can now come in from the edge, and we know that the inner part was 760 by 1,240. So if I come in here 230, that will be the end of the inner rug on the same on the other side. Now we know that the overall width 1,200, the inner part is 760. So I'll come in from this edge 220 and from this edge 220. And that's just giving some guide marks, and you can see that middle section is the size of the inner quadrant of the rug. So I'll add that into there. Now I can delete those guides and I can select all this, and I can now just make this a component that we will cleverly call rug. So on my layers line I've now got a rug, and I can turn the rug on and off just by hiding or bringing forward the layer. So now I understand what space I'm looking in. Now the next thing is I want to lay the top out. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this layer top, and we'll select that top layer. Now I want the top to be 700 millimeters wide. So if I now come in 250 from each side, 250 and 250, the gap between those two lines should in theory be 700, and it is. When we know we want the top to be pretty much the full length of the inner square, so I can now do that, make that a component, and we'll call that component top. Now I can hide the rug, and now I'm just working on the top, so I get rid of the guide rails. Now although the top is currently on the floor, again it helps me to line things up. So I can now come in and I can line up my legs. I know I want an overhang from the top of 25 millimeters, so I can come through and I can create a 25 millimeter overhang using my guides, and now I can make another layer, and I'm going to call this layer legs, and we'll select that layer. I then can draw my legs into these corners, and I think we said each leg was going to be 80 by 80. and I raise that. Now we know that the overall height of the top is 500 millimeters, but we know that the top itself is 30 millimeters. So 500 minus 30 is 407 millimeters high. That's the height of my leg. And I can make this a component that we can call leg. I can now copy that component into the corner, and I can copy these two components into that corner and get rid of the guides. So I've now got my 4 legs. Now I measure the distance between the legs. That's 1030, and we're going to put 2 drawers here. So 1030 divided by 2 is 515. So we make a new layer that's called draw, and we'll select that. Now we're going to have a bit of guesswork here, I think, so we'll just draw something on the edge, and we're going to make this 150 millimeters deep, and we're going to use 18 millimeters stock. And we know we want this to be 515 long. So I can now make that component, or we can call that component draw. I can now copy that component into there, and I can copy both those components, he says, here. So I've now got my drawers. I just want to change the orientation of these two because I want to make a bit of a change. So I'm going to flip those along the red direction, and now I'm going to turn off the legs. I don't want these drawers tight up against the legs. I want a small gap. So we'll come in and we will make a gap here of 1 millimeter. And then I'll just hide these for a second, and we make a gap between the 2 drawers of 1 millimeter as well. And now I can unhide those 2 drawers. So now I've got a gap between there of about 2 millimeters in the middle. See that? Good. Now I can bring my legs back in, and you're beginning to see the table very, very quickly take shape. And I don't need to worry for the concept drawing about anything in the middle. I don't need to do the draw bottoms, the draw sides, the dovetails, the blind dovetails, the inner carcass that holds it all firm. That just doesn't matter for a concept drawing. It's purely a visual diagram that we're after. Okay, now I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to call this layer skirts, and I'm going to put the side skirts on it here. Now we know we did those at 150, 18 millimeter stock, 150 deep, and we'll drag that one over to here, and we'll make that a component called skirt. Now I want a shadow line here. I don't want this to be flush to the leg. I want a shadow line, so I'm just going to put that in. So I'll put a shadow line of 2 millimeters in place, which is good. And now I can take this piece and I can clone it into here, and then I can move that one back 2 millimeters as well. That's looking good. So I can now come back to the top, and I can now raise this top and make it the 30 millimeters that we're looking for, and I can move this top up by 470 millimeters and put it into its final place. So you can see I used the top there as a way of laying out the legs, and what I now have is a concept of the table that we're going to build. So talking to the customer, I've got 2 drawers here, I've got my end panels, I've got my stumpy legs, I've got the right size, and now I can show it in context of the rug. So I can bring the rug back in so the customer can now really visualize what that's going to look like. I can go into the 3D warehouse and I can look for sofas, and I'm just looking for a standard 2-seater sofa in this, because the customer's going to put 2-seater sofas next to it. That one looks okay, doesn't it? So we'll put that sofa into the diagram. I'm just centering that up so it looks good. And that's good. And then we'll clone the sofa. Now the sofa's in place, we're just going to make a new layer and call that sofa. Select the 2 sofas. I'm just going to drop those onto the sofa layer. Okay. And then I can turn the sofas on and off. So I can now move the sofas and I can remove the rug. And now I can really just zoom in and talk about the features of the table. So I'm now going to add some scenes to this. We'll create the first scene. I'm just going to call this scene table. Then I'm going to create a next scene and I'm going to call the next scene sizes. And then I'm going to create another scene and I'm going to call the final scene situation. So I'm going to add another new layer now, and I'm going to call this layer xx_sizes. And now I can come in with my dimensioning tool and we can put some dimensions on this. Some dimensions that will help the customer to visualize this in a bit more detail. We'll call out that everything is going to be, I think it was American white oak. So I can now talk to the customer about, there's the overall simplistic design of the table. Here's the overall sizes for that. And now I can come into the situation and I can bring the rug back in and the sofa back in. And I'll give the customer this sort of idea of what that's going to look like, and we can update that. And there we go, that's the conceptual diagram done. What I like about this now is we've not spent too much time on this. We've got something we can now talk to the customer about. And if you remember where we started with this diagram, that's a huge step forward in terms of the conversation. We can now both share and visualize something. Now the customer can now really start to say, that's good, I like where it's going to, I like the simple lines, it's really fitting in with the units I've got, but I'd like it to be bigger. I'd like the legs to come out to halfway into this rug, please, so it's a bit more in keeping with the size of the sofas. So I can go back to my master diagram and I can bring my rug back in, and let's select both legs, and we're going to move these legs out by, let's call it 150. And then I can come around to this side and I can select both these legs and we can move these legs out by 150 as well. Now I can move this out by 150, make this longer by 150, swing around to the other end, and it's already, you see, it's already altered my drawers because they were a clone. Move this forward by 150. So you can now see that my dimensions have updated. My overall length is 1540 and my drawer is 663. And my situational picture is updated as well, and that table now looks better, much more in keeping with those sofas. If I could look at that and you say, I don't really want the rug there because that looks really rather nice, but that's a customer decision. That's it, and I think that looks good. So we're now in a situation where the customer knows what they're going to get. They're happy enough with this. It's not taking me too much time. I did this pretty much live in this video. What's that, 10-15 minutes? And I'm good to go.
So we're now getting closer. We've now got a concept that the customer signed off against. We understand our measurements and sizes and what this thing's going to look like. So in the next video, we'll turn that into the detailed design. See you soon.